So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So my name is Damien Clifford, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jonathan Liljeblad, who is a senior lecturer here in the college. And Jonathan's going to speak for about 20-25 minutes, maybe a bit less.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, we're very lucky to have Dr. Kate Ogg as the discussant, who is an associate professor here in the college. So that's enough for me. So over to Jonathan to get us going.
All right. Thanks, Damien. And then thanks for everyone for coming. You know, it's the end of the semester, and so, you know, my thinking was that everyone was going to be otherwise occupied, but I'm very happy to see the turnout. And I brought some specimens as well, so we can introduce them as physical evidence. I don't know if I'm going to go the full 25 minutes because I had tailored this entire presentation more towards like an actual conference, so, you know, as opposed to a seminar. But hopefully that facilitates some kind of discussion, and we can, you know, talk freely. Okay. All right. So the presentation that I have is based on research that was coming out of the initial grant round that the research office had provided for Rebecca, and then me, and then Rebecca Moeen. Yeah, sorry, Rebecca Moeen and me. Regarding gender issues across different countries in the developing world. This was actually meant to be a much bigger project, and a sort of an ongoing slate of issues that I wanted to cover around the Inle Lake region. It was supposed to go on for about 3 or 4 years. Because of events that are happening right now, unfortunately, that's not looking like it's going to be possible. So at the moment, and this is where I would really need some feedback from everyone, is that I'm trying to cobble together something out of the data that I have, and to at least say something that's constructive with the research that's been done so far, right? Whether or not that's feasible, you can tell me. All right. So the site of the research specifically is Inle Lake. So that's one of my photos of the lake itself, looking east. So this is part of the region that my family's from. So by way of background, I'm part of the Pa'o peoples of Shan State. So that's me in traditional dress on the lower right-hand side. You know, so we all have these turbans. I don't ordinarily wear traditional dress here. And then, you know, maybe one day I'll do it under appropriate circumstances. It's one of those things that is context relevant, and this is just not the context to be dressing like that. And so with this particular region, a lot of the access that I have is very much kinship based. So I'm relying very much on contacts that my family can provide for me. And a lot of the data that I've collected for this particular project and today's presentation came out of people who knew my brother. Right, so it's the same generation as my brother. They all grew up together, and because I was the brother of Mo Zawin, they felt comfortable opening up to me and having some impromptu conversations over the course of several years, and then more importantly, letting me observe their activities and sort of understand their rationale and thinking. All right. Wait, is it this? Oh, maybe. Oh, there we go. Okay. So to begin about the notion of indigeneity in a place like Myanmar, this is sort of a new concept. Historically, the notion of indigenous peoples or being indigenous did not exist, right? And in fact, if you talk to most of the people within the state now, and definitely particularly within the orthodoxy, so that includes the military, they're actually very resistant to this notion of indigeneity, indigenous peoples. Historically, the notion of traditional groups or traditional peoples was tied to the term ethnic nationalities. So if you look inside the 2008 Constitution, they actually use the term ethnic nationalities. That is sort of a legacy of the British. So when the British took over Myanmar or Burma in the 1800s, they had transposed the imperial system of categorizing different groups of people. So very like they had a categorization system for the populations of India, and they took that kind of conceptualization to Myanmar, Burma. Under the 2008 Constitution, there are about 135 recognized ethnic nationalities. Going to the current debates right now, at the more recent times, you're starting to see this term Tangnyinta. So this is relating to people who are specific to a geographic area. So they can identify a geographic location that's theirs, and it was theirs at the time of the British annexation. So this is around 1823. The problem with this is it doesn't distinguish between dominant versus subordinate groups, right? It only relates to the location of land. And so within the Myanmar government's perspective, they've adopted the logic of the Indian government, which is everyone is indigenous or everyone is traditional. So therefore the term has no meaning. What's happened since 2013, 2014 is that there's been this gradual introduction of the notion of the UN DRIP, so the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, along with ILO Convention number 169, which also deals with indigenous peoples, and to try and reflect some of the discourses, the international discourses and conceptions about indigeneity. There's now a new term that's been popularized, or it's trying to be popularized. It's Tane Tain Yenta. So this is trying to include this notion of dominant subordinate groups, right? So it's not just about a specific location in terms of an ancestral territory, but it's also having historical continuity, the ability to self-identify, but also that you are a minority that's subordinate to a larger dominant population. Now, why is this important? Because this then ties into the historical struggles that have occurred since, well, it started under the British, but it continued post-independence in 1948, which was about minority populations wanting self-determination, right? Smaller groups of populations that they want to be able to control their own territories. They want some kind of legal personality, which is tied to their notion of their own culture, so it's a cultural heritage. And the reason why all of this is critical, at least from my perspective, is that this then ties in the question of who actually controls resources: land, water, minerals, intellectual property, et cetera. So these components are very much similar to the other kinds of indigenous discourses that I think most of you are familiar with here in Australia. Now, around the Inle Lake area, so the thing about Shan State and the region and the area, this is one of the more ethnically complex areas in Myanmar. I've had different anthropologists tell me that there's actually around 36 more than 36 different groups within the area. And around Inle Lake, or contiguous to Inle Lake itself, the major groups are Dana, Danu, Intha, Kaya, Padang, Pao, Shan, Taungyo, or Taungyo. The dominant group is a group called the Intha. So Inle Lake is considered Intha land or Intha territory. The other populations, though, reside along the lake. Shan State itself is the land of the Shans. So the Shans are related to the Tayais of northern Thailand. So that particular indigenous group actually spans the border or crosses the border between the two. They identify Shan State as still, even now, they have discussions about it being a sovereign state. There are dreams of a restoration of the Shan homeland. They identify their own literature, their own poetry, obviously their own language, but then also their own political and legal legacy, because historically it was the land of the Shan kings or the Sabwas, and they had their own legal system and their own rules. And all of this is embedded within Myanmar Burma. So I have the map there. You can sort of see the main ethnic groups. Inle Lake itself, to help you get a sense as to where it's located. So what you see here is the borders of an area called Nyang Shui. It's a township. So this is the location of the township within Shan State in Myanmar. The area in blue that you see right there is Inle Lake. So that gives you a sense of its position. And then I included a satellite image for topographical purposes. So you can see here that it resides in a shallow valley with hills to the west, mountains to the east. The place where my family's from is would be up here in the mountains somewhere. But this is on a Shan Plateau, so this is roughly about 1,500, 2,000 meters above sea level. And then when you get to the place where I'm from, that's about 2,500, 3,000 meters, getting up to about that level. So the issues here is that Inle Lake has been considered or identified as an environmental disaster area, essentially. It's suffering from a decreasing size. It's disappearing. The area varies according to dry season or wet season. But since 1938, it's lost about a third of its area. Right. A lot of that disappearance is a combination of factors. There's been heavy deforestation, a lot of it related to the expansion of agricultural land, but also an increasing intensification of timber and mining. So when you have timber and mining, you get sedimentation because you get the runoffs coming down from the hills, right? And so a lot of those runoff comes through the streams and a river going this way, all right? Ordinarily, the sediment will get washed out of the lake, but the issue here is that there's also been an increasing amount of aquaculture and agriculture in this area. And so anytime you plant vegetation in the water, the roots are a catchment for sediment. So that's what's causing the decrease in the area. However, that catchment also means it's catching not just the sediment, but all the pollutants in the sediment. All right, so this includes the fertilizers, the pesticides, the mining runoff. So they've sampled phosphates, nitrates, mercury, other toxic substances coming into the area as well. In addition, one of the things that's happening now is that it's becoming a toxic waste site because they burn plastic rubbish in the lake because it's a safe space. They figure the water will just wash it out. In terms of the development, there's an increasing amount of population, so there's a lot of migration coming into the area. So it's not just indigenous peoples living there, it's also people from outside of the region. A lot of this is related to an increase in tourism and agriculture, as well as the timber and mining operations. Now, the group that I dealt with, and by the way, this is a pseudonym, this is not the actual name of the organization, but for the purposes of discussion, it's the Inle Professional Women's Association. Relatively recent organization. The founders were largely veterans of projects from the World Bank and the IMF. They're largely business entrepreneurs with good educations. And it was a situation where they basically came together. They said that they had concerns about what they saw happening at Inle Lake. The Inle Lake now does not match the Inle Lake of their childhood. Childhood's plural, and does not match the Inle Lake of their parents' generation. And so they wanted to take some kind of an action. But in addition to this, it was also that they wanted solidarity. They wanted to feel like they were part of a club or a loose-knit network of mutual support. And they didn't want men involved, they wanted women involved, right? So it was women, talking about women's issues. That was sort of the original motivation. Now, as part of their activities in terms of the things that they want to address, they've been engaging in a number of activities. So you see here, they're dealing with invasive species. So they're gathering water hyacinth. All right, that's considered an invasive species. Here, they're trying to provide skills training for villages. So they're teaching women how to sew, use sewing equipment. And this is one of their workshops, and appropriately masked during the COVID era. And these are maps of the major villages that they've been working in. All right. I'm not going to go through this entire slide. I'm presenting this to sort of identify some of the larger observations that I drew out of the time that I was there. So this is based on interviews as well as a survey. I've already talked about sort of the background and how they work. I've already noted the kinds of interests and the issues that they're trying to address. They actually do use the language of saying that they want to promote gender rights, right? Gender equality. They want to try and change their cultures regarding the treatment of women in the villages. But in addition to that, they also want to try and promote a greater role for women within the development process. So they're not subjects, but they're actually participants. That's sort of the language that they used. However, as part of all of this, they want to maintain some level of cultural identity, right? So it's not a situation where they want to feel like they're trying to adopt practices from another country and trying to transplant it inside to Inle Lake. They're trying to find things that they feel are appropriate or relevant to their culture, that are sensitive to the issues and concerns that they have, and that can maintain their social networks. All right? They don't want to see the social networks dissolve. And of course, they're dealing with the environment. Now, the challenges that they've been dealing with, and so these are the things that they were complaining about. So anything in the parentheses are my notes about the complaints that they registered. One is there is very much a traditional patriarchal structure, right? It varies from indigenous group to indigenous group. That, you know, as a matter of example, it was up until the 1980s that polygamy was a standard practice. So my uncles, my mother's brothers were both polygamous, right? So I had an uncle who had 5 wives, the other one had 3 wives. And you know, my mother says it's just something that we don't talk about at this point in time. There's also a challenge of patron-client relations. So as much as people, traditional people in Shan State sort of have this sentimental nostalgia for the era of the Savoies, they recognize that it was a patron-client system where you had a ruler at the top and clients at the bottom, and everyone was rewarded for their loyalty, right? And that legacy still very much exists now throughout, even within the political system. There's the challenges of democratization and federalism, even under the democratically elected government with Daw San Suu Kyi's NLD political party. There was never really a resolution of the questions of self-determination, right? So there still continues to be a certain level of dissatisfaction about the amount of self-determination the various people there have. And again, it relates to land, but also relates to their own heritage. So people can walk around Inle Lake and point to buildings and say, this used to belong to me, or this used to belong to my grandparents, or this was the former palace. There's a continuing persistence in the military. So the military, as most of you have probably learned over the course of the past couple of months, they permeate the entire economy, right? They own the hotels, banks, construction companies, they own the tourist companies. They own commodities producers, services companies. They also own consumer goods. So tobacco is an example. Beer is another one. Bottled water is another one. And it's a general pattern. What they do is that if they find out that there's an entrepreneur engaged in a profitable business, it's quite a common practice for the military to show up and say, oh, your business is now ours, right? And so with my family, that happened quite often. And they had a general practice that they would just simply stay in business for 3 years, because that's about the time around the world for businesses to start to become successful. And then the plan is they just quit, right? Because they know the military is going to take over, right? So this is the kind of thing that plays out. So this is the threat to any local efforts at self-empowerment. And of course, you have the issues of corruption that exist throughout the country. And it's a situation where anything that's deemed as a challenge to the status quo is problematic. So this includes things like human rights, gender rights, environmental rights, cultural heritage rights, self-determination. These are all incredibly sensitive issues. Now, what's really fascinating for me, and the thing that I sort of caught my attention, is pretty much the main theme about all my research in Myanmar when I talk to people, is how is it that when you're in a subordinate position of power, when you're dealing with something as powerful as the military, how is it that you are able to function, right? How do you resist, right? So for those of you who are familiar with James Scott's Weapons of the Weak, that's essentially the core of my entire research, and everything that I do is sort of based on his work and his conceptualization of the world. So what they've told me and the methods that they do is that when they do capacity building work or skills training, they just don't show up in a village, right? They negotiate for permission from the cultural leader, so that's usually one of the elders in the village, and then also from the political leaders, that's one of the government administrators, right? Also, they engage with the women in the village where they say, what is it that you want, all right? And if you do want help, we need you to submit a proposal or an application. So once that proposal or application is submitted, they also want some assurance that the villages, you know, as evidence that everyone is okay with this entire project. They make sure that there's the ability to reserve training space, accommodations for the trainers, and some amount of contribution to the fees that are involved. Usually they ask women who are receiving training to bring their own equipment. So this is like their own sewing equipment. If it's problematic, sometimes they can get funding to make donations, but usually it's about everyone bringing whatever they have, whatever resources they have. The other thing that I found interesting was that they try to engage with the men. It's, you know, as much as it's women's only, they do try to invite men to participate. They help the women in the villages. engage in discussions with their husbands and their fathers about their activities, what they're doing, what they're trying to do, the purpose of the kinds of changes that they're trying to bring. And it's an opt-in. So they said that sometimes there are men who do participate in their activities, sometimes there are not. All right. So, all right. Now, in order to make this academic, all right, I didn't tie this into the gender studies literature. I'm still sort of working my way through that, and I'm still trying to think my way through some of those nuances. For me, I'm much more interested in the law and development literature and trying to make an intervention into that kind of theory. And so a lot of the law and development literature that we deal with now in the current era of the field is about these bottom-up perspectives. And the question mark that I always have, well, what does that mean? Right? If we're trying to encourage bottom-up perspectives, then what does that actually entail? So on the left-hand side, I listed some of the common critiques that have been made by these bottom-up perspectives about development approaches. And on the right-hand side, some of the things that sort of caught my attention in the field work that I was doing. So one is that with the association, or the women's association I was dealing with, that they very much are trying to exercise some kind of self-determination, right? And it's a self-determination that's a cultural self-determination. They're basically trying to say that, look, this is our culture, it's not static, it's not isolated. We're trying to figure out how it's changing, how does it engage with all these other things that are happening, these other things that we want to see happen, right? So it's development, but it's our kind of development, is the way I would describe this. So this kind of relates to these critiques about, the normal development programs. They're accused of being neo-colonialist. So in other words, they impose a foreign vision of development, whereas here it's very much a cultural, local culture specifying what kind of development they want. The other one is that a lot of times aid programs, they exercise their own conception of indigeneity. So they treat an indigenous group as being monolithic, static, sort of like a museum piece. And here, it's very much about the women trying to express their own interpretation of what culture is. The other one is that there's normally an accusation that development programs are not context sensitive. They don't understand the local issues. So here, with what the activities of this association is doing, it's very much about pragmatism. Right? It's very much about trying to say, they recognize what they consider to be the priorities. They figure out what they think are the strategies that'll work, and then they look out for their own opportunities. The other one, or the third critique, is about this thing about top-down management structures. Normally it's donor-driven, so that decisions are being made in offices like Rome, Paris, New York City, etc. Here, this is very much about individual members of the association making their own decisions, so they're exercising autonomy, and they're very much trying to focus on their own empowerment, right? So it's not empowerment coming from Rome, it's about empowerment that they are trying to construct themselves. There's also a level of holism, so this is one of the critiques that I always have with aid programs. They tend to be very much thematic, and what the women that I've spoken to, what they see is that you can't disconnect these issues, they're all tied together, right? Land, water, culture are all tied together, right? So it's patently obvious for most of you in Australia who deal with Indigenous societies here. But the problem is aid programs don't see that kind of cross-issue linkage. There's also divisive donor practices. So a lot of the times donors, they pick and choose who they want to be aid recipients, right? They identify and figure out who is it that they prefer to work with. And here, what I've noticed is that there's an attempt, at least, at some kind of an inclusion, right? They're working across different indigenous groups. They're very pluralistic in that sense. They're working across different income levels. They're working outside of just women, but also trying to reach out to men. They're working across class and religion. So the implication from this, and this is sort of the larger discussion that I've sort of had in my mind, is that usually when we talk about law and development, development is done by taking international norms, trying to find some kind of a donor. So this is Asia Development Bank, World Bank, these kinds of entities. You find an implementer, and then they work with some of the aid recipients. In my mind here, we have a situation with this association where the aid recipients are perfectly fine, right? They'll take the money if you offer it. But they made it clear to me that they want independence. They don't want the conditions put on them by the World Bank or the IMF. They want to be able to do their own thing. And so it's much more about, can they find just an enabler, right? So what is it that can be done to enable these kinds of local movements? So that's essentially the discussion that I've been sort of thinking about in my mind. And that's pretty much the end of my presentation. I'm just putting up some miscellaneous images here just to give you have an idea is that there are faces, right? These aren't just abstract things. So these are the Intha. So they're famous because they row with the one leg, they row standing up. This is Pa'o. So these are like the women in my group, what they dress like. And they have the dragon scales, so we all get to wear the blue. They wear the turban, and then they have these little baubles in the turban that's supposed to represent the dragon's eyes. This is the Danu here, so they also have turbans. I think this is, this is Kaya. So this is the Kaya. So you see they tend to have this jewelry with the red shawl. This is Taunjo. So this is a very old photo from the late 1800s. This is they tend to have these shawls that they wear. And then this one, I couldn't resist putting this in. I just want to show you just how bad historical records can be. So this is a picture from the British Imperial Durbar that was held in Delhi in 1911. And the British record is that these are Burmese princes. And this is categorically false, blatantly wrong, right? Anyone who knows will look at the dress and say, these guys are Shan, right? Not just Shan, these are royal Shan, right? These are the Savois. They brought their wives with them, okay? And also to show you how dynamic the culture can be. So this is one of my mom's friends. My mom grew up with his daughter. So, and then the students that I took to Taunji last year were able to meet his daughter. Her name's Hema Taik, or Auntie Hema. This is Sao Shui Taik, so he was the first president of Burma. He was a Savoy, so he was one of the kings of Shan State. He actually served in the British military. Right, so he served with the British military in World War I and World War II. He wanted to try and modernize Shan State. Right, and they actually had discussions that they were going to try to stay in the Union, and after 10 years, they'd make a decision if they then become a sovereign state. Right? Unfortunately, assassinated. Right, was taken out. So in 1962, with the military coup, all the Shan kings were, they went to Rangoon to meet with the government, and then they were all imprisoned. Right, and then when they were returned, they were either killed in prison or they were given a mix. My mom said it was a mix of arsenic, mercury, and something else. So they would put trace amounts in the water. So they're all neurotoxins, right? So they mess with your head. So the men who came back were all vegetables, and so that's sort of the history of this area. And in the center, this is in Dane. So this is one of the religious sites around Inle Lake. And so again, whenever I take students to this area, I always take them here because this is one of the more significant religious sites around the region. Okay. All right, so I'll just stop there, and I guess we'll have conversations, questions, discussions. Oh, by the way, just to show you what Inle Lake does, consumer goods. So there's this. All right, so this is lotus silk. All right, it's made from a plant. And I'll pass this around so you can sort of get a sense as to what it feels like. But it's an incredibly laborious process. You take lotus plants, you snap them open, you pull out the threads. It's a practice in Vietnam, Cambodia, but then also in Inle Lake. And so this is what they're trying to say is an indigenous good that they're trying to sell on the market. All right, don't lose it, please. That was a gift. So, all right.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was fascinating and so incredibly rich. I mean, you started off by saying you wanted it to be part of a bigger project. I mean, I really see this project in and of itself as being, eventually resulting in a monograph or something. I understand you probably want to do more interviews. I suspect they were disrupted because of COVID, but I mean, there's so much depth and richness to this. So I guess I'm going to start off just by commenting on you said your main theme, which is when people who are subordinated, how do they resist? And I think I was so drawn to that. I find it fascinating. And what I would like you to draw out a little bit more is, I guess, the role of intersectionality, because the people that you did your research with, you could say they're subordinated in different ways and resisting in different ways. So there's subordination on gender. So you mentioned it's, patriarchal society. Subordination with, and I apologise if I'm not getting the right terms here, but maybe class or ethnicity, was you talked about the military and resistance to the military, but also resistance to the West as well. I mean, the idea that a lot of these aid and development projects are potentially forms of neo-colonialism. So I guess that's my first question, if you could sort of tease out these layers of resistance, from an intersectional perspective. And I guess my second question is the role that language is playing here, and language as maybe a site of resistance or a medium of resistance, because I was really drawn to, right at the very beginning, you were talking about this, even the concept or the term indigeneity it's really been popularised by, for example, the UN DRIP. It's not a concept or term traditionally used, and in the literature I'm familiar with, there's a lot of critique of the way indigeneity is used in international law and the actors involved, and there's a lot of critique about the actors mainly being men, and mainly being men from global north countries, and the extent to which there are women active in international law, for example, the creation of UNDRIP, it is mainly women from global north countries. So it's homogenising Indigenous people, and in particular, it hasn't, I don't think the processes at international law have been very good at allowing participation from, in particular, Indigenous women from lower income countries. And so sticking with this theme of language as a site and medium of resistance, you talked a little bit about rights, about the women you interviewed, fighting rights or gender equality. I'd really like to unpick a little bit what was meant by rights. Is this an understanding from customary law, or is this more of strategically using the language of human rights, which and there's a literature on that, and the deeper question is, and this is language in quite a literal sense. I assume that these interviews you did were not in English, and you are translating. Is that correct, or were they done?
A mix.
Yeah, and so your positionality as the interviewer, moving between languages and translating what your interviewee said into English when you eventually publish, and that word rights and how, and so your reflections on that process of translation. And then I think my last question to you would be so reflection on positionality, your position as the researcher, because I suspect in a lot of ways when you were doing this research, you were in some ways on the outside and some ways on the inside. Mm-hmm. You were an outsider and insider at the same time. So I thought, it's interesting you were saying you're from this community, but, as this, the organisation that these women started, you said at one point they didn't want men. So in a different ways, you're an outsider and insider. Mm-hmm. And so just your reflection on and your positionality and how that might influence the research as it develops and it's written up.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, and yeah, those are really good points. So the thing about intersectionality, for sure, and over time, that's one of those layers that I needed to really put into this and just literally break it down, because even the use of land varies by group, right? And so again, like I mentioned, that everyone recognizes that this is the land of the Intha, so that people, but it's also recognized that other people historically from other Indigenous groups were able to use the land. Mm-hmm. And so there's the notion of possession, use, inheritance. It always depends on the parties involved, depends on the group, and even depends on the negotiations that occurred as a result of that. And so a lot of the land transactions there, just an example. It comes down to you're the purchaser of something, either the land or the use of the land. You're talking to someone that you think is going to give you the rights, but the way you guarantee that is that both of you have to go to the village elder, who has a memory of all the past transactions that occurred regarding that land, and everyone agrees that that living memory is the official authority. And everyone is very reluctant to go to the law, because number one, the law, the courts weren't really reliable. Number two, the notion of title, like that concept, that's something that's very urban. It doesn't translate to a lot of these remote regions, and they still don't. If you try to explain the notion of title to them, it just doesn't, for whatever reason, it just doesn't fathom. They just cannot understand that there's this notion of title that's stored in an office somewhere that recognizes and that you record the chain of title. Like, that's like, why?
Yeah.
Right? Like, why is that even, why is that even relevant? And why are you paying money for the title when the land is there?
Yeah.
Right? So those kinds of issues. And then regarding like environment, so even there as well, there's also you mentioned intersectionality regarding the environment and some of these other components. And so similarly, again, there's just like we talked about environmental justice. In my mind, you kind of see these same patterns play out because there are some populations that are more affected by deforestation, mining than others. There are some populations that are more affected by the water quality than others. And so in my mind, there is a question mark, and that does need to be addressed on that front. The other, the issue of language, yeah, for sure. And this is what I always try to tell Westerners when they arrive in country is that everyone will always say, oh, Burmese is the real language of the country. And, well, okay, that's a Benedict Anderson imagined communities kind of a thing, right? That we're imagining something called Burma. And the British imagined something called Burma. And they imagined the borders that you see on the map. But that means that you're having to construct a national identity. And so a lot of what's occurred since 1948, and even the military will say this, is that they were trying to forge Myanmar. They were trying to defend the identity of Myanmar and unify the entire country along that theme. So that affected languages. It affected education. It affected rights under law and how people were treated. And so hence the reason why you get these categories of different ethnic nationalities. You also see that there's been a marginalization of a lot of the ethnic languages. And so even now there are complaints about this where they say that the languages that were taught in schools was predominantly Burmese language. And that anything else was sort of relegated to the side. And so that caused an evaporation or disappearance of these like Shan language, Shan literature, Shan poetry, Pa'o language, so these kinds of issues. But what's funny is that when you go out into the remote regions and you go into these villages, they only speak their local language because most of them dropped out of school by the time they were 8 years old. So they only speak the language of the family, which means that Burmese is their second language or their third language. Some of them, their English is actually better than their Burmese, which I think is quite interesting because there were Catholic missionaries in the area. And so to me, it's sort of this fascinating issue that crops up. And so when I have these interviews or these conversations, it ends up being this weird, it's not a dialogue. It's like people are switching back and forth between different languages and trying to figure out what is it that we're trying to say. And so when I'm talking, I'm normally having to actually simplify the English, and then we're trying to figure out, well, what's what is it that's in Burmese, what is it in Shan, what is it in Pa'o, what is it in Danu, and so it raises all these question marks then about, is this part of the reason why there's so much conflict? Because people are misinterpreting the issues that they think they're dealing with. The third thing regarding the notion of rights, yeah, for sure. The human rights movement and the indigenous rights movement is something that in places like Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, Malaysia, India, Nepal, Bhutan, there's extensive literature about a lot of this was introduced by IWGIA, the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, so that was Benota who gave his presentation a few weeks ago. That was his organization that was responsible for that. And he'll even admit it, that they were one of the main drivers of indigeneity in Myanmar, right? And so you can kind of see that unfortunately, it feeds into the xenophobic narrative that exists in Myanmar. So historically, it was always about outsiders, foreigners, trying to interfere with our country, trying to interfere with our society. And the issue now is trying to figure out, are the foreigners looking like you, or are the foreigners looking like people from Southeast Asia, right? And which one's more palatable? Having said that, with some of these domestic groups that are inside Myanmar, what they told me was the reason why they are adopting the notion of indigenous rights and trying to adopt the notion of human rights is because it gives a word to the problems they're having. It allows them to describe the experiences that they've suffered. And then more importantly, find some kind of a solution, right? Now, having said that, it's not perfect. So what they complain to me is that human rights is kind of clumsy in terms of how dealing with the land, right? And it's kind of clumsy when it's dealing with like the issue of culture, because it seems like the rest of the world doesn't understand land or culture, or no one else can agree on it. So it's these kinds of struggles. So they're doing it because it's an alternative to what they've been given by the status quo, where there was no response on those issues, but it's also an imperfect solution.
Yeah.
Right? So hence the reason why they bring in people like me. And I think this addresses the last point you make, which is my position. My position in relation to all of this. So it dawned on me, one of the aid workers was telling me, and it dawned on me that she was right, that the point of aid work isn't actually helping in terms of like being the savior. It's about providing orientation 101 into the global discourse, helping the locals understand what's this fancy language that these foreigners are talking about, and why are they so stressed out when someone uses the wrong words. Right? And it comes down to magic words. What are the magic words that makes everyone happy? And so I find out what I do is I'm trying to explain to them, well, these magic words have consequences, not in Myanmar, but in places like Australia, and places like Geneva, and this is what will happen if you use these words this way. And this is what happens if you don't use these words this way. Right? Yeah.
So, Molly.
I have a really simple question. You said that you don't wear the turban around here because it's not the proper context. And I'm looking at your pictures. It looks like everybody except the ones who are rowing are all wearing turbans. So what's the context that's appropriate for wearing a turban?
Well, it's not just the turban, it's the full dress. So even in country, when you go to Inle Lake, and this goes back to the dynamics of culture, is that people, especially the youth, I actually had this one teenager tell me, I don't want to dress like my grandfather. It's like I'll only do that for special occasions or if they make me. They look on YouTube and they say, oh wow, I want to look like the K-pop guys. Or, oh wow, I want to look like they look like in Malibu. Oh wow, all of these things, right? So there's that infection that's been going on. So that's part of that globalization thing. But you increasingly see a distinction, especially with the younger generations, between the past versus the future. And for most of the time, they're dressing what they think is the future. And they'll just wear the traditional stuff like this, if it's like a holiday, a celebration, where they know that they're engaged in some kind of a ceremony. But otherwise, yeah, it's interesting. Like people will get on the plane in Yangon, or before the coup, they would get on the plane in Yangon wearing, traditional clothes or whatever. They would get to the hotel in Bangkok and they would change to all Western clothing, And I see the same thing when people go back, is that they're wearing Western clothing when they get on the plane in Bangkok, and then as soon as they land in Yangon, they'll start to switch back to their older clothes.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's other questions.
Yeah, Rebecca.
Jonathan, that was great, and I agree with Kate. It sounds to me like you already have a book, the beginnings of a book. They're just an ethnography of aid and resistance and how people navigate. I had, so some of the things that really jumped out at me, just because you said you were wondering where to go with it next, one was the fact that I was struck by how the women were engaged in what liberal feminists would regard as domestic activities, so that, you know, it would be critiqued as conservative, and I wondered what your response to that would be. I was also wondering how much you spoke with how much did you learn, on your table you had that this group are avoiding, they pick and choose when they engage with the donors because of perceived constraints. I'm wondering if you can tell us anything about what the constraints, I mean, I can imagine obviously, but I'm curious as to what you learnt about what they perceive the constraints to be. And then I was also wondering if you could tell us a bit more, you've started to, but sort of hovering in the background of a lot of it for me was this question of land, ancestral connections to land, and questions of scale. Like, I was struck by your description of Indigeneity, like the dominant Indigenous groups at different scales, and how place, I think it's great for a political ecology analysis.
Yeah.
And I just wanted, I'd love to hear more about how land, place figures in all of this. I don't know, as a source of sustenance, or whether it structures what people can say in different places, where they feel empowered, whatever jumped out at you.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's so much there already. I think you have a book there.
Yeah. So regarding the political ecology thing, I actually thought about that, about, you know, sort of that approach, and, you know, I think it is very relevant. There are some complications though where it starts to break down. So one is the lands are not clear; they're kind of fuzzy, and so it's not like the idea of drawing boundaries, for example. It just doesn't. It doesn't compute. So just you were talking about the constraints of aid work. So aid programs in the past, they had some experiences where these NGOs came in, foreign NGOs came in, and said, "Oh, we're going to do land reform, right? And we're going to do customary land tenure," which great, wonderful. Everyone was saying yes, 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 yes. But then the very first thing that happened, the very first activity that was sought out was we need to map the lands, and we need to map out the boundaries. And suddenly everyone was like, "Wait, what? Map out the boundaries? Why do you need boundaries? If everyone can be on the land at the same time, then why do we need boundaries?" But boundaries implies that someone's going to be able to control who comes in and goes and leaves. And that just doesn't, and like even culturally, you know, you don't do that, right? And then, you know, the other thing that they said is entailed with that is it also implies that you can buy and sell. And okay, it works if you're a stranger, but what happens if it's someone you're related to? You never buy and sell with someone you're related to. You just don't do that, right? And so then why is it necessary to draw these boundaries? So this is where that kind of problem breaks down. Now, having said that, there are some sites where it is very clear that this is somebody else's, it's not yours, you're there, and whatever you do, you got to follow whatever they say. So one of the sites was Indane. So this one, another one is an area nearby, which is Kaku. So Kaku is like this, but it's up near where my family's from. And so Kaku is recognized as being Pa'o territory, Pa'o land. It's recognized as being Pa'o controlled. And even now, they said that it's recognized that if anyone visits there, you need to be accompanied by someone who's Pa'o. And even the tourists they have to go there with someone accompanied by someone who's Pa'o. And there's talk about Indane that the people are saying that they have similar concerns, that they want to be able to have that kind of place because it has that kind of significance culturally, not just in terms of religion, but also in terms of identity. All right. So you kind of get these kinds of things that play out. But yeah, no. There were some stories that they told me that there were other examples where they said that there were some constraints that the aid program. So one is the timetables. That the money it goes on 1-year cycles. They need to have indicators. They need to have timetables. They need to have results done by the end of the year. And they said here what the problem is for them, that because of the sensitivity of some of these issues, because again, you're challenging the status quo, it takes time. Right? And you have to work through informal networks, because if you go through the formal meetings, the immediate question is no. And it takes time to nurture, sort of convince. And like I mentioned here, they were having conversations or discussions with the men. Right? Well, those discussions are very personal and very delicate, and they take time to negotiate those kinds of conversations without it erupting into some kind of a village crisis. And so they said that like that time limit, they just can't deal with it. They just can't work with it.
Anne?
I just had a follow-up question about that. That was really interesting. Thank you. And I'm not sure if you know the answer to this, but so in those careful negotiations that are happening as they're trying to build community through these informal networks, what kind of language are the women, what are they using? And I'm not sure if it's rights or something else.
You mean like?
Okay, how would they describe the project for themselves, would you say?
Yeah, so the way they would normally describe it is that it's socialization. They're socializing. And they normally justify everything they're doing by saying that we just want women to be able to talk to each other. And all these other things are just, well, this is what happened when we were talking. Right? And wouldn't it be great if we could all do something together? And this is the way we feel community, is because we're doing these activities together. And we decided this is the activity we wanted. And the main driver is always, we just want to socialize, we just want to hang out, we just want to, be able to feel like we're not alone. And one of the founders of the organization actually told me, she used those words, I was tired of being alone. And I wanted to be with other women. Which to me was fascinating, right? Because she was a community leader, she's one of the wealthier people in the community, and you figure someone like that would be able to talk to anybody, but she was like, no. And so when they go in to a lot of these villages, it's sort of that same theme, and they said it's more innocuous than saying we want to teach your women how to make their own money. Like automatically that starts to make a lot of the men feel very defensive. And it's like, oh, we want to help your women learn how to do organic farming and not use fertilizers and pesticides. And suddenly the administrators start to become a little bit defensive, because that implies that they're mismanaging the environment, right? Because they've been criticized for so long about environmental destruction. And it's sort of like, rather than trying to even touch on all that, they just say, well, we're just meeting, we're talking, and we just want to do stuff together, like that kind of approach.
Yasmin?
Yeah, thanks for that presentation. I'm actually an undergrad law student, but working part-time with the World Bank Pacific, so I really appreciated your comments around that. Something that stood out to me was when you mentioned how kind of, issues affecting, let's say, local women would be multifaceted. It wouldn't just be on one theme. So what do you think is, I guess, the role of organisations as flawed as they are in creating more of a kind of comprehensive, multifaceted approach? Is it kind of saying, here is money, what do you think is most important to spend it? What's their role in that space?
Yeah, well, that was the slide before this one, that was the logical implication that I was drawing out was, the entire model of aid work, are we doing it wrong, right? That if we're serious about bottoms-up approaches, is it better to just simply make an effort to learn about what the locals are doing and to figure out what is it that is that we're okay with, and then saying, okay, we just want to let you guys do what you do, and here's some money, and if you need to talk to somebody, here's we're available, that kind of a thing. The alternative, but this is where we get into development politics, is that, and I've talked with different NGOs in Myanmar about this, that they need to talk to each other. There needs to be more coordination. And so the gender-based violence, NGOs, they're dealing with the same people as the environmental NGOs, as the Indigenous rights NGOs. They need to talk to each other, right? Because what I see happening a lot of the times is that people will tell me that, like, oh, this NGO said one thing, this other NGO said something else, and they're telling me not to listen to the other one. So it's a competition, and in that situation, the locals just simply tune out and just say, well, you guys figure it out. I don't know what's going on, and what, all these Westerners, they can't agree with each other, then why should I, listen? And so, in my mind, it's like, well, just a little bit of coordination would resolve all of those issues, right? But so far, I recognize the challenges because everyone is on different calendars, everyone has different personnel, everyone doesn't have the same level of trust in each other, these kinds of issues.
It's right on 2:00. So, Damien, did you want to close or?
No.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. That was fascinating. I'm sure we are all looking forward to watching this research progress and hearing how it progresses because it's fascinating.